Hey everyone, time for another video. Back in the fourth quarter of 2010, Intel released this, the dual-core Pentium E5800 for the LGA 775 socket. The 5000 series, along with the 6000 series, were essentially the exact same as the 7000 series, with the big difference being a reduction in L2 cache from 3MB to 2MB in total. But as a processor released just over 8 years ago of any use for gaming today? Well, that's what I'm going to find out, as I put the Pentium through a couple of benchmarks and some relatively modern games as well, to see if a 50pence processor would be any good for a budget system nowadays. Based on the Wolfdale architecture, the E5800 is clocked at 3.2 GHz and features no turbo boosting or hyperthreading whatsoever. It has an 800 MHz frontside bus and features 228 million transistors built on the 45nm fabrication process with a 65W TDP. Originally, the E5800 was launched at a price of $75 US, which is around $86 today, adjusting for inflation, which is also around £67 or €75 today. I bought it for 50pence at CEX here in the UK, and despite it being out of stock right now, you'll be able to get it for the same price I did when it's back on sale again. You can also buy it for around $5 in America from eBay, which is a bargain for a processor which is still perfectly usable today, with plenty of room for overclocking, as you'll see later on. The rest of the system I'll be using for the test today features a Foxconn G33m motherboard, 8GB of DDR2 RAM at 800MHz, an MSI GTX 1080 Armour OC Edition graphics card to eliminate any potential bottlenecking, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and a Phanteks TC14PE to keep the processor cool. First up is Cinebench R15, a multi-threaded benchmark popular with extreme overclockers designed to test your processor's multitasking performance by rendering a photorealistic 3D scene. The fastest processor I've tested in Cinebench so far on my channel was the 2.8 GHz Core 2 Duo E7400 at a score of 146, but the higher clocked E5800 Pentium managed to take the top spot with a score of 158, 8.1% faster than the Core 2 Duo. Overclocking wise, however, the E5800 managed to run stable at a speed of 4.1 GHz, a near 1 GHz overclock over the stock speed. I achieved this by setting the frontside bus speed to 1025 MHz with a voltage of around 1.344 volts to 1.36 volts, which pushed the memory up to 1026 MHz. At this speed, the E5800 managed a score of 203, 28.4% faster than stock, and only 5.4% slower than the Core i5 3317U. The i5, however, uses substantially less power than the E5800 does. Moving on to the physics section of 3D Mark Firestrike, in the E5800 at its stock speed of 3.2 GHz with 800 MHz memory, managed a score of 2,765 points. But overclocking it to the same 4.1 GHz as Cinebench ran at bumps up the score by a massive 42.89% to 3,951 points. As normal is Grand Theft Auto 5, which had its PC release in 2015. The game is running at 1080p with the lowest settings possible, and throughout the city, the Pentium micro stuttered throughout, and FPS was in the high 10s to around 30 frames per second at best, but the micro stuttering was fairly obvious at times, and occasionally the inputs locked up for a fraction of a second as well. There was still some micro stutter out in the desert area too, but there were moments where it ran reasonably smooth out there. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 27, 13 and 4 frames per second respectively, and had several spikes in the frame times of around 200 to 380 milliseconds throughout the game, showing just how bad the stutter got at points in the test. Moving on to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, I tested this at 1080p on the lowest settings on a competitive hard difficulty bot match on the Mirage map. The Pentium had some issues with stuttering at times throughout the map. FPS was in the mid-30s up to the mid-80s, and combat was somewhat difficult as well due to the stuttering at points. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 61, 34 and 23 frames per second respectively. There were also several gaps between some of the frames of around 60 to 120 milliseconds, which you will definitely notice throughout gameplay. Next up is my personal favourite game right now, Warframe, which had its initial release in 2013. The game is also using 1080p at its lowest settings, and I'm also testing it in a survival mission on Jupiter. The Pentium throughout the mission managed FPS in the low 40s to the high 80s range, depending on the area of the map you're in, and how many enemies are around you at the time. Despite this though, there were minor brief lockups occasionally, and also some noticeable micro-stuttering, especially when turning the camera. The benchmark showed an average of 57 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 35 and 29 frames per second respectively. There were also a couple of frame time spikes throughout the test of around 50 to 80 milliseconds, although these weren't noticeable as they didn't happen particularly often. Rise of the Tomb Raider showed some pretty severe stuttering throughout gameplay, which didn't make combat impossible, but definitely had an impact on it. There were times in which the FPS dropped below 20, and throughout the game there were some pretty severe lockups as well. The performance was at its worst in the Soviet installation, in which the FPS made for a pretty jarring experience, with very obvious stuttering and lockups throughout. The benchmark showed an average of 31 frames per second, but with 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 9 and 6 frames per second respectively. There were also multiple frame time spikes throughout the game of around 105 to 220 milliseconds, with some as bad as 1 to 1.7 seconds at the worst. Moving on to overclocking, and I was able to push the E5800 pretty far. At stock, it runs at a speed of 3.2 GHz, but as I mentioned during the Cinebench and Firestrike benchmarks, I was able to get 4.1 GHz out of it with around 1.344 to 1.36 volts. And that was stable for Grand Theft Auto 5, CSGO and Warframe, with a small increase in voltage to around 1.36 to 1.376 volts. Rise of the Tomb Raider, however, had to be dropped down to 4.06 GHz, with the same voltage to maintain stability. I also had to reduce the memory clock to 667 MHz in the BIOS to keep the game stable, which, with the overclock, has the memory at 854 MHz in Grand Theft Auto 5, CSGO and Warframe, and 846 MHz in Rise of the Tomb Raider. With the 4.1 GHz overclock, Grand Theft Auto 5 was actually kind of playable despite still having some noticeable micro-stuttering at times. FPS throughout the city was around the high 20s to the high 30s, and there was no noticeable input lag or input locking at all. There was the occasional brief lockup throughout gameplay at times, but the game, however, does run reasonably smooth at points. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 36, 18 and 12 frames per second respectively, and there were several spikes in frame times of around 80 to 300 milliseconds at the worst throughout the test. The overclock had a pretty big impact on CSGO's performance, as you can see from the average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 83, 48 and 37 frames per second respectively. There was no obvious stuttering or locking up at all throughout the test, and overall the game ran pretty smoothly. FPS was in the high 50s to around 100 frames per second at points, and even spiked to around 130 frames per second indoors. There were multiple spikes in frame times though of around 40 to 80 milliseconds, but these weren't really noticeable at all during the test, and they're unlikely to bother you during gameplay. Warframe also showed a noticeable improvement as well. FPS was in the 60s to around 90 frames per second, and there was no noticeable stuttering throughout the test. The brief lockups seen at stock clocks were gone as well, and despite some spikes in frame times of around 50 to 80 milliseconds throughout, the game actually ran pretty smoothly and was an enjoyable experience, which the benchmark shows, with average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 66, 39 and 33 frames per second respectively. Rise of the Tomb Raider couldn't manage 4.1 GHz like the others, but as I mentioned it managed 4.06 GHz fine, and with the overclock, despite a slight improvement overall, as you can see from the average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 38, 13 and 8 frames per second respectively, the game wasn't playable at all. It was actually still really stuttery at times, and combat was also still pretty difficult too. There were drops below 15 frames per second, and there was an issue with texture popping with the interior of the wolf den taking a little bit longer to render. Throughout the Soviet installation, the stutter made the game a pretty jarring experience, and there were spikes in frame times of around 85 to 540 milliseconds at the worst, which shows just how bad the performance was despite the overclock. Overall, the Pentium was actually pretty fun to test. It managed an overclock 900 MHz beyond the stock clock, and made some of the easier to run games, CSGO and Warframe for example, an enjoyable experience as long as you overclock. Rise of the Tomb Raider and Grand Theft Auto 5 still showed a lot of problems even after the overclock, so I wouldn't recommend the Pentium E5800 for those games at all, but any older or easier to run games will most likely be alright. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and giving it a like as well. You could also subscribe to my channel and maybe even support me on Patreon if you'd like to see more content like this. So thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.